Hi everyone. Mary are here back.
We're back.
Mary and Delicia.
Yes.
So we have many topics we want to talk about, and I want to give a shout out to the people who are commenting to us and telling us that it's resonating with you and connecting with you, and also some topics that you want us to bring up or have bigger conversations about. Going back to like the first episode where we kind of talked about a lot of things as an introduction, and now we're going into deeper conversations with each different larger theme. Um, and something that we wanted to touch upon today is talking about white privilege, about intersectionality, and how we recognize our own privileges as we navigate the margins of being a woman or identifying as Latina. And this is, again, speaking from my experience, from Mary's experience, and we are talking it out and processing it through this with you. So whatever we say is coming from our lived experiences. So if you have a different experience and want to talk about that, please comment on that and let us know. But keep that in mind when we're having these conversations of like the perspective through which we're coming from. And before we talk about, I guess, white privilege, I wanted to talk about intersectionality, which is work done by Kimberly Crenshaw, and we'll link everything in the bottom. Like she has a really great article that you can learn from, and she has a YouTube video that's really helpful to understand. But basically what she says is that we all hold all of our identities at the same time, but also some identities are more salient and more present during other times. So all these identities like intersect and create who you are as a person in society. So for me, I'll identify right as first generation, Latina, woman, middle upper class. So we have different identity markers that connect us to how we navigate in the world. And that connects to white privilege and how we operate under like whiteness in society. So that's kind of where the conversation is going to go today. And yeah.
All right. Yeah. So Delita gave a nice introduction of, intersectionality and all your identities. And so today what we're going to talk about is white privilege and how some of those factors determine, where we align with whiteness or where we're marginalized and our experiences. So the first thing that I want to kind of start this out with is just kind of recognizing and listing out the privileges that I've recently reflected on myself and what I have. And then, Delicia, if you want to do the same afterwards,
Yeah.
we could do that. So one of the first things that recently, I've realized is probably the number one biggest privilege is that I was born in the United States. That's privilege number one. From the day I was born, that's a privilege that many people seek, that many people come to this country for. And, this American dream, and to have citizenship and to be a part of the US. And oftentimes it can't be achieved, and it's really hard to become a citizen in the United States, which I think most people don't realize how difficult that process is. And that's a topic for a different segment as well.
Yeah.
So that's one of the biggest privileges that I have in terms of, my own family or people in Paraguay that I've recognized. And then that I speak English. So, we've talked about language a lot and how speaking a different language within the United States is marginalized. And so our parents, I'm sure, had a very different experience where they had to learn a new language and kind of leave their first language behind. And so that's another privilege that I carry. And like Delicia said, the area that we grow up in. So we grew up in middle upper class, Somerset County in New Jersey. And so that alone gives us privilege in education. It gives us privilege in our neighborhoods, safety of our neighborhoods, and a lot of, systemic privileges there growing up in that environment. And then another privilege is that I can associate more so with whiteness because of the color of my skin. So we're talking phenotype, right? So there's a lot of things that I will never understand or not understand, experience because of the color of my skin, right? So I'm not Black, so I don't experience a lot of the things that Black people do. So where I can use my privilege is to step in when they are being marginalized or oppressed. And so that's where I have to recognize that, yes, even though I am Latina and that's something that I identify with, and I have my own, discriminations and everything like that, in hindsight, I do have more privilege than others. And that's the whole idea of privilege and the term white privilege, that I think sometimes people misunderstand and find offensive at first, before like really reflecting and really understanding where you might have more privilege than someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the first privilege that Mary identified is like citizenship privilege. And I think that was really salient when I was abroad, in undergrad, but also even more so now as a professional in Brazil. For those of you who don't know my story, I was abroad in Brazil as a Fulbright grant in 2018. And so that's under the US Department of State, right? So we are a direct arm of diplomacy when we're serving in that capacity. So having that citizenship as an American, but also holding that role and that title in country in Brazil is a different set of privilege that you experience when you're abroad, right? So understanding how we navigate all those different layers when we hold a US passport and being an expat abroad, I think is very interesting. And some people don't understand that until they get to travel. Because if you're only having an experience in the United States and in country, it's easier to say maybe we're more marginalized within the experiences in the US. However, like Mary mentioned, we grew up in Somerset County, so we hold several socioeconomic status privilege that drives our experiences and drives the communities in which we engage in. And I think part of that white privilege, like we're connected more towards whiteness because we don't identify as Black. We don't have Black ancestry. So we're operating under all of these different layers and these intersections of our identity. And part of that is learning to become an active bystander in spaces that we see discrimination or we see something that's not right. And it's not to say that we don't experience things in our day-to-day lives or our work experiences because of the way the world works and the US, how it's set up. But recognizing our privileged identities to use as part of building advocacy and being the voice or someone who steps in when we see something that's not right. Like an example, like at my previous work when I worked in higher education, one of my coworkers was Black and had an afro to work, and during an event, like a coworker came and was like, "Oh, your hair is so pretty," and like touched her hair, and it's like you physically cannot do that. So I was like, had to be like a barrier between this coworker and my other coworker,
Right.
and it's like you can't do that, and
Right.
it's uncomfortable because the other person's like, oh, but I'm just trying to say something nice, or I'm trying to like compliment her, and then she gets mad and defensive, and it's like, no, but you need to understand like the root of why that's wrong or why that's inappropriate. First of all, like personal space, and now this was pre-pandemic, so now
That's 6 feet.
like 6 feet distance, right? But so using like your space and your privilege to, because my coworker was paralyzed, she was like, couldn't believe that that was happening.
Yeah.
So in that space, we can step in and kind of, that's just one example, but I'm sure if we open this conversation to other people, they can share what they've maybe experienced. But and if you don't understand what we mean by white privilege, we mean it, yeah, it's understanding how the US and the world is set up in this binary of white and black. And the closer you are to whiteness, the more privileges you have. That's just a fact, right? We operate under culture of whiteness and a culture of white supremacy. So that is the benevolent group of people. And we can go into the weeds of history at another time of like how that was created and constructed in the world. There are actual documents that describe white people a certain way and black people a certain way that was created by Prince Henry in 1946.
Yeah.
I mean, 14 something. No, 1446. I don't know. We'll get you the
Going
history
way
facts.
back. Yes. Yes.
But we wanted to keep this more of a like a social inner conversation about how we experience these certain things. But we will get to history because you know I'm a nerd.
Yes, we will get you those facts. But yeah, like Delicia said, it's important to realize where you have that privilege and, you know, maybe step in where a situation like that happens. And, you know, it's just kind of like why that person sort of doesn't even understand the basics of personal space. Like, can then the person in your scenario where, you know, that person was touching this girl's hair, it's kind of like, would she appreciate if someone did that? It just kind of comes down to respect. Yeah, maybe the intent, you know, wasn't malicious, but the way it's received is what's important, and that's not okay. So there's just like a lot of layers in terms of, like you said, where to step in and where privilege comes in, and it might not be as obvious in some situations, but that's where you kind of have to step back and reflect and understand where you do have privileges.
Right. And one thing that we always talk about too is like kind of now maybe that we're older, we can kind of put a name to it and figure out like why we maybe engage like with code switching as part of like assimilation, and that shows up in many ways, like how someone talks or how someone dresses or how someone approaches a situation is all part of code switching. And now reflecting on that understanding is like code switching relates to adapting to whiteness and white culture to be able to navigate predominantly white institutions like we went to in college or working in corporate or in higher education, that are spaces that are very Euro and white centric. So very early on, we received messages of how to act, on how to dress, on how to be, and how to exist in this world. And now reflecting on it is very part of code switching. And I don't know if that relates to like unconsciously, like how we have to assimilate to be part of this culture so we can prove that we're American enough for living, existing in these spaces, and how we are fairer skin, right? Talking about phenotype and how we do have Spanish ancestry and Eurocentric maybe features, and how that is part of our white privilege, and really deconstructing that to understand that it is what it is, and how do we use that as a positive thing for activism and how do we show up? Like, I saw this really beautiful imagery in Kentucky during the George Floyd massive protests that were happening. In Kentucky, there was like a barrier of like white identifying individuals and fair skinned people barricading like the Black protesters behind them, and they served as like this barrier moving forward to protect them, right? Because that they hold white privilege, so the police officer is not going to shoot them on sight as if it were directly a Black person. So I think all those different layers, and it's hard for some people to reckon with white privilege and to say I hold it, is because white guilt comes up, right? So another academic term and another like framework for understanding is like, we all have internalized whiteness. So white guilt comes up and says, well, that's not our fault that we didn't buy the slaves, or we didn't enslave these individuals, our ancestors did. And then you feel guilty about that, and white tears come up, and white fragility is at play. So there's so many layers to deconstruct, and we're hitting the surface of this conversation, but we think it's important because not only with Black Lives Matter, but also is all part of like activism and raising awareness. And it connects to like our Paraguayan American identity, because in Paraguay, there were German, Italian, European immigrants. So there are a lot of people who are blonde, blue eyes, and very fair skin. So this racism and white privilege holds true in Paraguay as well. This is not just an American thing. This is true globally. So we're trying to raise awareness within our community here in the US, but also parallel conversations that, like we mentioned in our previous videos, that the activists in Paraguay are also having these conversations.
Yeah, like Delicia said, it actually, you kind of brought up like, where did that come from, where, you know, we kind of learned to assimilate with whiteness. And, you know, I think that's growing up in, again, middle upper class, majority white people. So that assimilation with whiteness in how we speak really resonates, because, you know, oftentimes I get, oh, you sound so white. I get that a lot, because, you know, the first thing that they see, I'm not white. Like, they know that I'm from somewhere. And so the first thing that they ask when I speak is, oh, you sound so white. And so it's just like, I don't even know what to say to that. Yeah. It's like, what do you mean I sound so white? So yeah, that's like a lot of kind of reflecting on how we grow up in the societies that we did. And like you said, it's not only in the United States, it's global. And that's like really important to acknowledge as well, because we see that in Paraguay, for example, there are lighter skin, blue eyes, fair skin, and we see that in our families. I have family members who, you know, are lighter, blue eyes, fair skin, and it was kind of always like, oh, they have blue eyes and fair skin, and it's like this like amazing thing, you know, and they assimilate more with whiteness, obviously, because of their features. But yeah, it's just something to kind of acknowledge and recognize. And it's something that maybe you haven't thought about before. But that's why we're starting this conversation.
Yeah, and how it operates and comes up in like family dynamics and between like friend groups, and we talked about this, I think, in the first episode about hay que mejorar la raza.
Yes.
And like we talked about how we didn't hear this in our family or like our immediate like connection, but I've heard it like in telenovelas, I've heard it like on social media, I've seen it, and I've seen it like, and I've seen like actual Paraguayans like say this on social media, like if someone marries like a very Eurocentric white person, who may be Argentinian or like from Europe or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just, why is that comment necessary to say like hay que mejorar la raza? And that is remnants of racism and colorism and internalized whiteness that we experience in the society that we live in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're trying to unpack that and unearth that and unlearn that, because why are you trying to mejorar la raza? That's telling me that there is something deeper saying that whiteness is better than
right.
if I were dating like a dark haired person or like a black person or an Asian person or whoever, purple, green, orange.
Right. What would you say about that? Right. It's like, where is that rooted in? And
right. So then that like gives messages to like younger girls or men or whoever of, okay, so they internalize that message of saying, oh, I should date someone fairer skin, and they're internalizing that whiteness and growing up with that and unpacking that and understanding that as is. So there's just so many layers.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up though, just like with the younger generation, even our generation, like what impact that has on confidence, self-confidence. That's where self-hate starts. That's like, okay, well, I have darker hair, darker eyes, darker features. That means I'm ugly, or like, that's essentially what that phrase or similar phrases do. And that's how the society looks to those lighter phenotypes as something that looks or is more accepted as beautiful in our society. So yeah, it definitely, it triggers like a lot of different points, not just, within your family or whatever the case may be. It really impacts someone individually, and then that goes to mental health and having to unteach that, no, you're beautiful, your features are beautiful, you're beautiful the way you are.
As you exist.
Yes. Don't listen to them. Nonsense. But yeah, it does a lot of damage having that thought.
Yeah, absolutely, because that's the message they're receiving. Is like, oh, that's bad or this is good, and the binary, right, that we operate under. So yeah, the detriments that it can have with younger generations and even people our age, right? If they're not going through this unlearning, decolonizing process that we're engaging in, then they're gonna be upset because they're not meeting this standard that is like existing, and it can be very negative in their life.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is the conversation for today. If you have any comments, any experiences that you've gone through or are unpacking as well, leave them in the comments or email us or DM us. We want to hear from you as well and your experiences. We want to keep this an open conversation, as we've mentioned previously. So hit us up.
Yes, hit us up. Let us know if this is resonating with you, any other topics that you want to hear, and we'll stay in touch.
Ciao.
Ciao.